بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. مثل الذين اتخذوا من دون الله أولياء
الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الرحمن علم القرآن، خلق الإنسان علمه البيان. الشمس والقمر بحسبان، والنجم والشجر يسجدان. والسماء رفعها ووضع الميزان، ألا تطغوا في الميزان، وأقيموا الوزن بالقسط ولا تخسروا الميزان. والأرض وضعها للأنام، فيها فاكهة والنخل ذات الأكمام، والحب ذو العصف والريحان. فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان؟ خلق الإنسان من صلصال كالفخار، وخلق الجان من مارج من نار. فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان؟ رب المشرقين ورب المغربين. فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان؟ مرج البحرين يلتقيان، بينهما برزخ لا يبغيان. فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان؟ يخرج منهما اللؤلؤ والمرجان. فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان؟ وله الجوار المنشآت في البحر كالأعلام. فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان؟ كل من عليها فان ويبقى وجه ربك ذو الجلال والإكرام فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان يسأله من في السماوات والأرض كل يوم هو في شأن فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان سنفرغ لكم أيها الثقلان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان يا معشر الجن والإنس إن استطعتم أن تنفذوا من أقطار السماوات والأرض يا معشر الجن والإنس إن استطعتم أن تنفذوا من أقطار السماوات والأرض فانفذوا لا تنفذون إلا بسلطان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان يرسل عليكما شواظ من نار ونحاس فلا تنتصران فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان فإذا انشقت السماء فكانت وردة كالدهان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان فيومئذ لا يسأل عن ذنبه إنس ولا جان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان يعرف المجرمون بسيماهم فيؤخذ بالنواصي والأقدام فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان هذه جهنم التي يكذب بها المجرمون يطوفون بينها وبين حميم آن فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان ولمن خاف مقام ربه جنتان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان ذواتا أفنان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان فيهما عينان تجريان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان فيهما من كل فاكهة زوجان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان متكئين على فرش بطائنها من استبرق وجنى الجنتين دان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان فيهن قاصرات الطرف لم يطمثهن إنس قبلهم ولا جان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان كأنهن الياقوت والمرجان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان هل جزاء الإحسان إلا الإحسان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان ومن دونهما جنتان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان مدهامتان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان فيهما عينان نضاختان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان فيهما فاكهة ونخل ورمان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان فيهن خيرات حسان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان حور مقصورات في الخيام فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان لم يطمثهن إنس قبلهم ولا جان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان متكئين على رفرف خضر وأبقري حسان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان تبارك اسم ربك ذي الجلال والإكرام صدق الله العلي العظيم.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد يا علي يا عظيم يا غفور يا رحيم أنت الرب العظيم الذي ليس كمثله شيء وهو السميع البصير وهذا شهر عظمته وكرمته وشرفته وفضلته على الشهور وهو شهر الذي فرضت صيامه عليه وهو شهر رمضان الذي أنزلت فيه القرآن هدى للناس وبينات من الهدى والفرقان وجعلت فيه ليلة القدر وجعلتها خيرا من 1000 شهر فيا ذا المن ولا يمن عليه من علي بفكاك ركبتي من النار في من تمن عليه وادخلني الجنة برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم رب شهر رمضان الذي أنزلت فيه القرآن وافترضت على عبادك فيه الصيام، صل على محمد وآل محمد وارزقني حج بيتك الحرام في عامي هذا وفي كل عام، واغفر لي تلك الذنوب العظام فإنه لا يغفرها غيرك يا رحمن يا علام. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم إني أفتتح الثناء بحمدك وأنت مسدد للصواب بمنك، وأيقنت أنك أنت أرحم الراحمين في موضع العفو والرحمة، وأشد المعاقبين في موضع النكال والنقمة، وأعظم المتجبرين في موضع الكبرياء والعظمة. اللهم أعظمت لي في دعائك ومسألتك، فاسمع يا سميع مدحتي، وعجب يا رحيم دعوتي، وأقل يا غفور أثرتي. فكم يا إلهي من كربة قد فرجتها، وهموم قد كشفتها، وأثرة قد عقلتها، ورحمة قد نشرتها، وهلكة بلاء قد فككتها. الحمد لله الذي لم يتخذ صاحبة ولا ولدا، ولم يكن له شريك في الملك، ولم يكن له ولي من الذل، وكبره تكبيرا. الحمد لله بجميع محامده كلها على جميع نعمه كلها. الحمد لله الذي لا مضاد له في ملكه ولا منازع له في أمره. الحمد لله الذي لا شريك له في خلقه ولا شبيه له في عظمته. الحمد لله فاشي في الخلق أمره، وحمده الظاهر بالكرم مجده، الباسط بالجود يداه، الذي لا تنقص خزائنه ولا تزيده كثرة العطاء إلا جودا وكرما، إنه هو العزيز الوهاب. اللهم إني أسألك قليلا من كثير، ما حاجة بي إليه عظيمة، وغناك عنه قديم، وهو عندي كثير، وهو عليك سهل يسير. اللهم إن عفوك عن ذنبي، وتجاوزك عن خطيئتي، وصفحك عن ظلمي، وسترك على قبيح عملي، وهلمك عن كثير جرمي، إنما كان من خطئي وعمدي. أتمعني في أن أسألك ما لا أستوجبه منك، الذي رزقتني من رحمتك، وأريتني من قدرتك، وعرفتني من إجابتك، فصرت أدعوك آمنا وأسألك مستأنسا لا خائفا ولا وجلا، مدلا عليك فيما قصدت فيه إليك، فإن أبطأ عني عتبت بجهلي عليك، ولعل الذي أبطأ عني هو خير لي لعلمك بعاقبة الأمور. فلم أر مولا كريما أصبر على عبد اللعيم منك عليك. يا ربي إنك تدعوني فأولي عنك، وتتحبب إلي فأتبغض إليك، وتتودد إلي فلا أقبل منك، كأن لي التطول عليك. فلم يمنعك ذلك من الرحمة لي والإحسان إليك، والتفضل علي بجودك وكرمك، فارحم عبدك الجاهل وجد عليه بفضل إحسانه، إنك جواد كريم. الحمد لله مالك الملك مجري الفلك مسخر الرياح فالك الأسباب ديان الدين رب العالمين. الحمد لله على حلمه بعد علمه، والحمد لله على عفوه بعد قدرته، والحمد لله على طول أناته في غضبه وهو قادر على ما يريد. الحمد لله خالق الخلق باسط الرزق فالك الإسباب ذي الجلال والإكرام والفضل والإنعام، الذي بعد فلا يرى وقرب فشهد النجوى تبارك وتعالى. الحمد لله الذي ليس له منازع يعادله ولا شبيه يشاكله ولا ظهير يعادده، قهر بعزته الأعزاء وتواضع لعظمته العظمى فبلغ بقدرته ما يشاء. الحمد لله الذي يجيبني حين أناده ويستر علي كل عورة وأنا أعصي، ويعظم النعمة علي فلا أجازي، فكم من موهبة حنية قد أعطاني وعظيمة مخوفة قد كفاني وبهجة مونكة قد أراني، فأثني عليه حامدا وأذكره مسبحا. الحمد لله الذي لا يهتك حجابه ولا يغلق بابه ولا يرد سائله ولا يخيب آمله. الحمد لله الذي يؤمن الخائفين وينجي الصالحين ويرفع المستضعفين ويضع المستكبرين ويهلك ملوكا ويستخلف آخرين. والحمد لله قاسم الجبارين مبير الظالمين مدرك الحاربين نكال الظالمين صريخ المستصرخين موضع حاجات الطالبين معتمد المؤمنين. الحمد لله الذي من خشيته ترعد السماء وسكانها وترجف الأرض وأمارها وتموج البحار ومن يسبح في غمراتها. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. الحمد لله الذي يخلق ولم يخلق ويرزق ولا يرزق ويطعم ولا يطعم ويميت الأحياء ويحيي الموتى وهو حي لا يموت بيده الخير وهو على كل شيء قدير. اللهم صل على محمد عبدك ورسولك وأمينك وشفيك وحبيبك وخيرتك من خلقك وحافظ سرك ومبلغ رسالاتك، أفضل وأحسن وأجمل وأكمل وأزكى وأمى وأطيب وأطهر وأسنى وأفضل ما صليت وباركت وترحمت وتحننت وسلمت على أحد من عبادك وأنبيائك ورسلك وصفوتك وأهل الكرامة عليك من خلقك. اللهم وصل على علي أمير المؤمنين ووصي رسول رب العالمين عبدك ووليك وأخي رسولك وحجتك على خلقك وآيتك الكبرى والنبأ العظيم. وصل على صديقة الطاهرة فاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين، وصل على سبط الرحمة وإمامي الهدى الحسن والحسين سيدي شباب أهل الجنة، وصل على أئمة المسلمين علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي والخلف الحادي المهدي هججك على عبادك وأمنائك في بلادك صلاة كثيرة دائمة. اللهم وصل على ولي أمرك القائم المؤمل والعدل المنتظر وهفه بملائكتك المقربين وأيده بروح القدس يا رب العالمين. اللهم أجه الداعي إلى كتابك والقائم بدينك استخلفه في الأرض كما استخلفت الذين من قبلك، مكن له دينه الذي ارتضيته له، أبدله من بعده خوفه أمنا يعبدك لا يشرك بك شيئا. اللهم أعزه وأعزز به، وانصره وانتصر به، وانصره نصرا عزيزا، وافتح له فتحا يسيرا، واجعل له من لدنك سلطانا نصيرا. اللهم أظهر به دينك وسنة نبيك حتى لا يستخفي بشيء من الحق مخافة أحد من الخلق. اللهم إنا نرغب إليك في دولة كريمة تعز بها الإسلام وأهله، وتذل بها النفاق وأهله، وتجعلنا فيها من الدعاة إلى طاعتك والقادة إلى سبيلك، وترزقنا بها كرامة الدنيا والآخرة. اللهم ما عرفتنا من الحق فحملنا، وما كسرنا عنه فبلغنا. اللهم المم به شعثنا، واشعب به صدعنا، وارتق به فتقنا، وكثر به قلتنا، وعزز به ذلتنا، وأغن به آئلنا، واغذ به عن مغرمنا، واجبر به فقرنا، وسد به خلتنا، ويسر به أسرنا، وبيض به وجوهنا، وفك به أسرنا، وأنجح به طلبتنا، وعنجز به مواعدنا، واستجب به دعوتنا، واعتنا به سؤلنا، وبلغنا به من الدنيا والآخرة آمالنا، وأتنا به فوق رغبتنا يا خير المسؤولين وأوسع المعطين. اشف به صدورنا، وأذهب به غيظ قلوبنا، واهدنا به لما اختلف فيه من الحق بإذنك، إنك تهدي من تشاء إلى صراط مستقيم. وانصرنا به على عدوك وعدونا إله الحق آمين. اللهم إنا نشكو إليك فقد نبينا صلواتك عليه وآله، وغيبة ولينا، وكثرة عدونا، وقلة عددنا، وشدة الفتن بنا، وتظاهر الزمان علينا. فصل على محمد وآله، وإنا على ذلك بفتح منك تؤجل، وبضر تخشف، ونصر تعز، وسلطان حق تظهر، ورحمة منك تجللناها وآفية منك تلبسناها برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم برحمتك في الصالحين فأدخلنا وفي عليين فارفعنا وبكأس من معين من عين سلسبيل فاسقنا ومن الحور العين برحمتك فزوجنا ومن الولدان المخلدين كأنهم لؤلؤ مكنون فأخدمنا ومن ثمار الجنة والحوم الطير فأتئمنا ومع الشياطين ومن ثياب السندس والحرير والاستبرق فألبسنا وليلة القدر وحج بيتك الحرام وقتلا في سبيلك فوفق لنا وصالح الدعاء والمسألة فاستجب لنا وإذا جمعت الأولين والآخرين يوم القيامة فارحمنا وبراءة من النار فاكتب لنا وفي جهنم فلا تغلنا وفي عذابك وهوانك فلا تبتلنا ومن الزقوم والضريع فلا تطعمنا ومع الشياطين فلا تجعلنا وفي النار على وجوهنا فلا تكببنا ومن ثياب النار وسرابيل القطران فلا تلبسنا ومن كل سوء يا لا إله إلا أنت بحق لا إله إلا أنت فنجنا. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم إني أسألك أن تجعل فيما تقضي وتقدر من الأمر المهتوم في الأمر الحكيم من القضاء الذي لا يرد ولا يبدل أن تكتبني من حجاج بيتك الحرام المبرور حجهم المشكور سعيهم المغفور ذنوبهم المكفر عن سيئاتهم وأن تجعل فيما تقضي وتقدر أن تطيل عمري في خير وعافية وتواسي في رزقي وتجعلني ممن تنتصر به لدينك ولا تستبدل بي غيري. أعوذ بجلال وجهك الكريم أن ينقضي عني شهر رمضان أو يطلو الفجر من ليلة هذه ولقك لي تبية أو ذنب تعذبني عليه. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. يا ذا الذي كان قبل كل شيء ثم خلق كل شيء ثم يبقى ويفنى كل شيء. يا ذا الذي ليس كمثله شيء ويا ذا الذي ليس في السماوات العلى ولا في الأرضين السفلى ولا فوقهن ولا تحتهن ولا بينهن إله يعبد غيره. لك الحمد حمدا لا يقوى على إحصائها إلا أنت. فصل على محمد وآل محمد صلاة لا يقوى على إحصائها إلا أنت. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. إلهي وكفى السائلون ببابك ولاذ الفقراء بجنابك ووقفت سفينة المساكين على ساحل بعد جودك وكرمك يرجون الجواز إلى ساحة رحمتك. إلهي إن كنت لا تغفر في هذا الشهر الشريف إلا لمن أخلص لك في صيامه وقيامه، فمن للمذنب المكسر إذا غرق في بحر ذنوبه وآثامه. إلهي إن كنت لا ترحم إلا المطيعين فمن للعاسين، وإن كنت لا تقبل إلا من الآملين فمن للمقصرين. إلهي ربح الصائمون وفاز القائمون ونجا المخلصون، ونحن عبيدك المذنبون، فارحمنا برحمتك واعتقنا من النار بعفوك يا كريم يا أرحم الراحمين. وصل على محمد وآله الطاهرين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم أدخل على أهل القبور السرور. اللهم أغن كل فقير. اللهم أشبع كل جائع. اللهم اكس كل أريان. اللهم اقض دين كل مدين. اللهم فرج عن كل مكروب. اللهم رد كل غريب. اللهم فك كل أسير. اللهم أصلح كل فاسد من أمور المسلمين. اللهم اشف كل مريض. اللهم صد فقرنا بغناك. اللهم غير سوء حالنا بحسن حالك. اللهم اغفر عنا الدين وأغننا من الفقر إنك على كل شيء قدير. سورة المباركة الفاتحة.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Say Shabbir Kirmani, respected elders, brothers and sisters in Iman, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Surah Fatiha is requested for the Salah Sawab of the Marhumeen listed on the screen, and for all Marhumeen. Al-Fatiha. Amun Jibu is requested for the names listed on the screen, and for all those in need here and elsewhere. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Amman yujibu al-mustarra idha da'ahu yakshifu su'. Amman yujibu al-mustarra idha da'ahu yakshifu su'. أَمَّنْ يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرَّ إِذَا دَعَاهُ يَكْشِفُ السُّوءَ أَمَّنْ يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرَّ إِذَا دَعَاهُ يَكْشِفُ السُّوءَ أَمَّنْ يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرَّ إِذَا دَعَاهُ يَكْشِفُ السُّوءَ. Daily Quran Tafsir Sessions. We will have daily Quran tafsir sessions with Sayyid Shabbir Kirmani at 7:30 p.m. with elaborations of certain verses within the juz of the day. He will provide a window into the apparent and hidden meanings of the miracle of a text, one which is clear and understandable for people of all backgrounds. He will also provide an introduction to each chapter under discussion and focus on the context of revelation, the historical background, as well as the spiritual, theological, and ethical interpretations of the holy text. A Ladies' Bazaar. Today the ladies will be holding a bazaar at the ladies' dining hall after the main program. Items include designer dresses, hijab, perfumes, and much more. Anyone interested in having a stall can contact Sister Musa Deuji at the number on the screen. Sponsorships and donations. We would like to take the opportunity to thank all our sponsors for the support for the month of Ramadan. Our budget for the entire month is $109,150, and we have achieved $56,045 so far. There are many opportunities to support your masjid, including sponsorship for niyaz, tabarruk, hadiyah for the speakers, and as well as the general Shahr Ramadan fund. We suggest a donation of $200 per family for the Ramadan fund. However, any amount is welcomed. Please contact Brother Murtaza Kareem or Sister Batul Muki at the number on the screen, or go to our website's payment center to make a donation or to sponsor. We will also have a donation table set up outside if you would like to make a donation in person. At this time, I'd like to invite Sayyid Shabbir Kirmani to come recite tonight's majlis with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
على محمد وآل محمد. رحم الله من قرأ سورة المباركة الفاتحة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. فوض أمري إلى الله إن الله بصير بالعباد ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل ونعم المولى ونعم النصير. والصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على الرسول المسدد المصطفى الأمجد المحمود الأحمد الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيت الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين المنتجبين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. اللهم صل على وقل رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد، قال الله تبارك وتعالى في كتاب الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ياسين والقرآن الحكيم. صدق الله العلي العظيم. زينوا مجالسكم بالصلوات على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد. My respected elders, brothers and sisters in Iman here in Florida and across the globe, wherever you're hearing my voice, Salamun alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Question: how will we be remembered? Keep that question in the back of your mind, inshallah we'll return to it. We have been discussing Surah Yaseen, the heart of the Quran, chapter 36 of the Quran, which we have been told in authentic narrations that everything has a heart, and the heart of the Quran is Surah Yaseen. And we've been discussing the fact that it is because of the fact that the entire creed of Islam can be encapsulated in this blessed chapter. And yes, we do indeed recite this chapter when someone passes away, when someone is in their final moments. And we do it for the Isal-is-Sawab, and as we should, and as is recommended. But that is one aspect of the equation. That is one part of the equation. That is one portion of the equation. The other part of the equation, which is just as important, if not more important, is the fact that it is a book of life, and this is the beating heart, and that is the heart is that element of the body that indicates life. As long as the heart is beating, you know someone's alive. When the heart ceases to beat, you then realize that that individual is no longer living. Therefore, if we take this analogy on board, that if the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt are telling us that this chapter is the heart, that means that this is what is going to give me life in my own life. At the first level. The second level is we've said that we are trying to get modern guidance. We're trying to understand our modern world and reconcile it by understanding the heart of the Quran, which encapsulates everything that I need to know. And try to give it guidance, try to give me guidance and you guidance in our modern world to how do we reconcile this world that we live in. So the first question I want to ask is, how will you be remembered? How will I be remembered? Not as an individual, as a society. Allow me to explain. We and our youth and our young and old alike, we go to school. We go through K through 12, then we go to university, and then some people go on to professional school. You study many subjects. You study, for example, geography. You study social studies. You study mathematics, physics, chemistry, X, Y, and Z. All very good. One of the subjects that you study is history. And when you and I study history, we study, for example, American history and the history of the United States where we live. We study, for example, the history of Europe. We study European history. We study the history of, for example, the East. We study global world history. Why do we study history? We study history oftentimes to try to gain lessons, to try to understand what happened, to try to understand what was going on at that time, what were the circumstances that existed, how did people interact in that environment, what were the beliefs that people had. Because we have this saying and this slogan that history repeats itself. That is, if I understand the cycles of history, I can then begin to understand where is the trajectory of society going, and I can act as such. As Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen says to his wasiyah and his will to his son, Imam Ali says, my son, look at the beautiful advice. He says, I read the pages of history, and I invite, for example, this is a lesson to his son, but also to us. He says, I learned and I read the pages of history of the past civilizations that were there before us, up until it was as though I was walking amongst their ruins. You know, when the archaeologist goes into the pyramids, or they go and see and study what was going on in past civilizations. You know, just a few weeks ago, they found an entire town in Egypt that was thousands of years old, and it was as if it had not been touched. You know, there are certain magnificent secrets of our world. We still don't know how the pyramids were made, how they were made thousands of years ago. But yet we have this concept that not only us, if you study history, every single nation in their period of time, they thought they were the best thing ever in history. We similarly have the same psychology of human nature, of the crowd. We think we live in the best time, in the best period, in the best era. Now allow me to get back to my point here. The point that I'm driving at is, how do we remember England in the 1800s? How do we remember Europe in the 1700s? How do we remember America in the 1600s? How do we remember China in the 1,000 years ago, 1,100 years ago? How do we remember, for example, the Muslim Empire? Historians have said very clearly, when you study the Muslim Empire, there was only a 300-year period where progress came, 800 AD to 1100 AD, which was called the Golden Era. That is where algebra came from. That is where much of the chemistry came from. That is where much of the sciences came from. That was called the Golden Era of Islam. At least that's what historians say. Now, this is all, we study these periods of industrial revolutions and things of the likes. Here's the question I want to ask you and I. 100 years from now, 200 years from now, 300 years from now, how will we be remembered? What will those future generations look back at our society and say about our society? Did we have it right, or did we have it wrong? And if we had it right, what did we have right? And if we had it wrong, what did we have wrong? You see, the Quran is inviting us to reflect, and the Quran is constantly reminding us to be humble. وَسَوَاءٌ عَلَيْهِمْ أَنذَرْتُمْ أَمْ لَمْ تُنذِرْهُمْ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ. The next verse that we are continuing with in the chapters, verse number 10 of Surah Yaseen. What does Allah tell the messenger? Allah tells the Holy Prophet, there are some of them, whether you remind them or not, whether you remind them or you don't remind, it makes no difference. They weren't going to listen to you anyways. You see, human beings often get arrogant. And the Quran constantly reminds us to become humble before the Creator. You see, when one is arrogant, you begin to notice that individual and that society's decline. You know, history teaches us a lot. Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen, he's saying, I walked amongst the ruins of past civilizations. Why? He says, although I did not live as long as them, I learnt what brought them good and what brought them harm. You see, history, when we study history, we realize what brings you good and what brings you harm. But Huxley and many other writers and philosophers have said, perhaps the biggest lesson from the pages of history, not only Huxley, Toynbee, for those who may remember the historian Toynbee, the great historian of the 20th century, he said it. Hegel, many other philosophers over the years have said, the biggest lesson of history is that man does not take heed and learn from history. We don't read history, we don't learn from history. We make the same mistakes. The Quran is inviting us and telling us the exact same thing. The Quran was a book for life. The Quran was a book for guidance. The Quran was a book to solve your and my problems. But yet, unfortunately, we don't read it. We don't reflect on it. We don't contemplate on it. The Quran is doing one thing, inviting us to contemplate on God and His creation, and to get us on the straight path. If you recall, one of the tragedies in our world is people don't read. We don't read. And you know what the paradox of reading is? The paradox of reading is many people say, I don't have time to read. But if you ask philosophers and people who study sociology and society, do you know what the goal of a book is? Fiction or non-fiction? The goal of a book is to save you time. Yet many of us say we don't have time to read. How does a book save me time when I spend 2, 3, 4, 5 hours reading a book? You're telling me it saves me time? I've mentioned to you this example, I'm reminding you. Jeff Bezos, the wealthiest man on the planet, said that one book changed his life, Remains of the Day. It was a fiction book, but it taught him a lesson. He was living on Wall Street and he had a very comfortable life. He was one of the youngest partners on Wall Street. He was set. What caused him to move across the way, go across the country and set up this new business? I'm not recommending you do that or not do that. I'm just getting a lesson here. The book said it was about a driver who spent his whole life driving for other people, and at the end of his life, he had regret. The regret was, I wasted my life. Bezos read that book and said, I cannot waste my life. Many of us, we don't read, we don't learn, we don't reflect on the Quran, we don't reflect on secular books, and the result ends up being, you waste your life. Not everyone, but many people. Or you read something at the end of your life and you think, perhaps I wasted my life. If I knew this in the beginning of my life, I would have spent my life in a different direction. That's why it's so important that we need to develop the relationship between youngsters and the elders to learn lessons. There's many things that you can learn in our modern world that we have at the click of a button on the internet, which are beautiful. But there are some things that you can only learn through experience. You can't buy experience. That's where that relationship is very important. To ask an uncle, to an aunt, to ask an elder who's been through the terrain. So coming to our modern world, the Quran says in chapter 10, whether you remind them or not, it makes no difference. Some of them, they have no interest in listening to you whatsoever. So what defines our modern world? What makes our modern world where we live, our world, what it is? And when we understand this, we then begin to realize, perhaps, how will future generations look at us and analyze us? And when they look at us and analyze us, what problems will they find in us? For example, if you go back and study 500 years ago, when we look at society 500 years ago, we say people were not so rational. People were not so logical. Is it possible that 500 years from now, when people look back at our society, they say this was the most unhappy era in history, based on what happened to the minds of people? You see, whether you realize it or not, we're going through an experiment of the world. We have one slice of time. What do we make of that time? So there's a few traits that are part of modernity. I would invite the youth especially to study the concept of modernity. You'll understand where our modern world came from and what made it. So one era of time is the Enlightenment period, which took place in Europe in the 16 and 1700s. And it was a move away from religion and towards rationality. So one element that emerged was that modern societies, the first element of a modern society is secularization. That religion is no longer primary. Whereas religion was primary in the past, religion is no longer primary in modern societies. It's a part of the definition of a modern society, secularization. So on one side it's beautiful, because I don't have to be persecuted for being a Shia, like I'm persecuted in many parts of the world. If I go to parts of the Middle East or, for example, in Asia, just because of my name, for example, I may be assassinated. I may not have to deal with that within a secular state, in a secular environment, although I may have to deal with other problems. What are those other problems? Do we reflect on them? And I've already mentioned some of them to you before. The data is very clear. Modern societies are very unhappy. Although we have everything material, we have all the bells and whistles, we're not happy. We're anxious, we're depressed, and a slew of other issues that we're facing. Why? The first element of modernity is a secularized system, secularization. Number two, progress. This is a very interesting word. If you study the pages of history, people always believed that the world was cyclical in nature. It went through cycles. There were good times and bad times. Things went through a cycle, and they repeated this cycle over and over again. Times were good, times were bad. Times were good, times were bad, and they repeated this cycle over and over again. Our modern world says no. The graph of society is constantly moving in the better direction towards progress. In theory, this sounds beautiful, but there's problems here as well. Are we necessarily going through progress? What's the proof that maybe we're not going through progress? Exactly what I just mentioned. Why is it that if everything seems to be advancing economically, medicine-wise, in every different aspect, why am I getting unhappier? That means the graph, one graph may be rising, the other graph may be falling. I need to study this because I need to understand my environment. If I don't understand my environment, what ends up happening is I become a victim of my society and I get very sad and depressed. Do you know, COVID has made this even more difficult. The level of people suffering with mental health challenges, isolation, has become tremendously difficult. It's exacerbated the problems. Introverts are dealing a lot worse with this than the general population. We need to be mindful of these things. What are other elements? The third element, individualism. This is one of the biggest ones. Our modern world, there's a definitive question that philosophers say that we ask, and I know this is something that some of you may be like, where am I going with this? You see, this is at the heart of everything. This is at the heart of existence. I'm trying to solve one of the biggest conundrums that our generations face, and that is a sense of emptiness inside. A crater-like emptiness of why am I here? What's my purpose? What am I doing? And do you know what happens when you don't have a sense of purpose? When you don't have a sense of belonging? You try to fill it with anything that you can get. You try to fill it with externalities. You try to fill it with buying a nice car, a nice house, a nice watch, a nice X, Y, and Z. And although those all may be good, you can never fix those problems because those are problems of the soul. You cannot put bandages and lipstick on your problem and think it's going to solve your problem. I just said something very heavy. You cannot put lipstick and bandages on your external problems and think they will solve the problems of your soul. That's the real crux. I've told you this before and I've told you again. You may find an environment where we are focusing solely on externalities with no focus on the internalities. And the result becomes the same thing. We catch the wave of modernity and we go towards secularism and we lose our belief system. I want to pause here for a moment. We have narrations that are very clear from the Ahlul Bayt. For example, what? The sayings of the Ahlul Bayt tell us very clearly, as the time of the Zuhur of the Imam of our time gets closer, will things get better or worse? Well, from one side, they may get much better. From another side, they may get much worse. In terms of development, things may get much better. But in terms of the aqeedah, the belief system, and what you and I believe, things may get much worse. The third level of modernity, individualism. So, secularization, progress, this idea that progress is linear and it's always getting better and there's no ebb and flow. If COVID teaches us anything, if the recession in 2007, 2009 teaches us anything, the drawback in the time of COVID teaches us anything, we're not always 100% going progressively. It's an illusion. The third is individualism, and this is the big one. I get a job, I study, I go to university, I get my degree, I get a bachelor's, master's, PhD, and then I get a job. And I'm not judging anyone here, I'm just allowing us to reflect on this, because the Quran says reflect, remind and reflect. فَذَكِّرْ إِنَّ فَعْدَ الذِّكْرَ سَيَذَكَّرُ مَن يَخْشَى. And remind them, for verily reminding benefits. I get a job, and I move across town to, let's say, California. And I moved to California. My family is here, as in my parents may be here, my cousins may be here, my relatives may be here. And I move on to this other part of town, of the country. And when I move there, I live in a completely different world. Now, I may be able to build a social network if things are positive. But if you connect this with what I told you a few nights ago, data shows that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to make friends in America after the age of 30. It becomes extremely difficult. So if I know that the data is saying that people are more individualistic, people don't have time for other people don't have anything in terms of a community, then what's going to happen when I move across town? Across the nation? I'm not telling you not to do it. I'm asking you to reflect on this. Individualism, on one side, the goal of individualism is to maximize the potential of the individual. So they become the best that they can be, by getting the best degree that they can get, by getting the best job that they can get, by being the best that they can be. But what's the consequence of being the best that you can be oftentimes, in the material sense of the word? You end up very lonely. Why do they say it's very lonely at the top? It's a very American statement. By the way, don't think that I'm saying that everything's wrong with America. There's beautiful aspects and I'm not talking about America, by the way. I'm talking about modern societies. This is just as true in Japan. This is just as true in Korea. Korea is more modern than the West, although it's geographically in the East, if you've studied South Korea. If you studied Japan, you know that Japan is much more modern than anything in the West, although it's physically, geographically in the East. I want to share something with you. Do you know how dire the circumstances gotten into Japan? You can study Japan to try to see where we're going, because they're ahead of us in many respects, in terms of the modernity cycle. You know, in Japan, people are paying other people to come over just to spend time with them, because they have no social networks. I'm saying this in a world, in an era of time where we have everything in terms of social media. We have 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 followers on social media. And we think that we have all of these connections that we think are real. But we realize that there's no reality there oftentimes. Japan, people are having relationships with their significant other, with their spouses, in a way where they are having someone on the digital sphere, in their phone, not a real person, a digital avatar as their spouse or their girlfriend or whatever term that they use. What do you think that's going to do to the mind? We're meant for human connections. We're living in a digital era, in a digital sphere. The Quran is constantly trying to remind us, do not lose your connection to Allah, because there's only one way that you will get peace in your heart, and there's no secret. I've told you to you before. Ala bi zikrillahi tatma'innal qulub. Verily in the remembrance of Allah do the hearts find solace. Verily in the remembrance of Allah do the hearts find peace and tranquility. You will never get peace and tranquility in externalities. I, with my hand on my heart, have visited and seen in my travels, wherever Ahlul Bayt have allowed us to go, in Europe and in America, many people who by society's standards, they have everything. Inside, they tell me in confidence, I hate my life. Baba, do you know what you have? People would die and kill to have what you have. But they said, this is the most empty, frivolous thing that I've ever had. You see, Peter Thiel, for those of you who know, Peter Thiel is one of the people who invested in, the first outside investor in Facebook. Peter Thiel. He's written a book called 0 to 1. It's a book many entrepreneurs recommend. You should have read it. Peter Thiel is also part of the PayPal mafia, the people who built PayPal and are one of the strong forces in Silicon Valley. He said he was part of a law firm. You know, he was a graduate of Sanford and the top schools. He got a job into a top law firm. And he said something interesting. He said it was a law firm that everyone on the outside wanted to be on the inside. And everyone on the inside wanted to be on the outside. You see, sometimes we spend our whole life trying to get somewhere, trying to achieve something, and at the end of the road, we realize there was an entire rat race. So why am I here? What am I doing, and how will I be remembered? Do not just absorb what society says one should do. Think, stop, pause, and reflect on what I'm meant to do and why I'm here. When you introspect, you may find that there's a unique gift that Allah has given you that He's given no one else. That may be your ability to speak, that may be your ability to write, that may be your ability to communicate with people, that may be your ability to bring people together. That may be your ability to foster action. In our world, there are people like Martin Luther King who have existed in America. There are people who have been causes of change, who are trying to make the paradigm better. You and I have that potential just as much, if not more than anyone else. And as followers of the Ahlul Bayt, and if the Quran teaches us any lesson, it's that the prophets were reformers to try to make society better. So the question that I ask myself and you is, what are we doing to reform society for the better? Are we simply taking society as we see it and absorbing it? Or are we doing something to make society better? Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib, this individual, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad, 63 years on this planet. What did Ali ibn Abi Talib achieve? Ali ibn Abi Talib lived several lifetimes in a span of 63 years. Am I on track to live several lifetimes in my 60, 70, whatever amount of time God has given me? Or have I just bought into the narrative that my job is to wake up in the morning, go to work, come home, eat, sleep, repeat, rinse and repeat? I'm not saying work's bad, work's very good, and we've talked about this from the Islamic perspective. But the question boils down to my why. Is my why focused on me, or is it focused on outside? You see, when you analyze this, you realize that history, which people are remembered? Those people are remembered throughout history who dedicated their life to others. Look at all the prophets. Prophet Ibrahim, Prophet Musa, Prophet Isa, Rasulullah himself. Look at the Imams. Did they ever do anything for themselves? It was for the betterment of society. Take a secular example. Which people are remembered? Do you know how many people the graveyards are filled with across the globe who became the wealthiest people of their society? But they did it solely for themselves. Nobody remembers their names. They're unknown. So who's remembered? The likes of Mandela are remembered. Mandela, good person, bad person, that's not my judgment to make. He spends 27 years in prison, fighting for a cause, for a struggle, to bring equity to his community and his society. He's in prison unjustly, and then he rises. When he rises through that, he brings change to his community, not for himself necessarily, but for his society. And he's remembered, and he will be remembered. Who else? I've given you several other examples, but read the pages of history of people who did it for selfless gains. Society only remembers those people who do it for selfless causes. So what I'm inviting you to do is in work, in life, in business, whatever you choose to do with your life, make it a paradigm and make it a question that you ask and make it a principle that you will do that which makes the world a better place. Period. Number one. If you look at the life of Amir al-Mu'mineen, he was struggling the same way. Mandela, when he did his struggle, he was not doing it in isolation. He had studied the lives of other people throughout history. Do you know what the book that got him through was? Through his 27 years in prison? It's a book called Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, who's one of the Stoic philosophers. You see, I may tell you the teachings of Ahlul Bayt, but many times what happens is people say, well, that's the Imam, that's the so on and so forth. But these people in secular society are following the same patterns that the Imams did. Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen, during the time of the first three Khulafa, for 25 years his right is usurped. Did he give up his mission? He never gave up his mission. He struggled through that time. So the question that I ask you and I and myself is, what are we struggling with in order to make the world a better place? And as we conclude, I want to ask myself and you a question. I was asked this question on a trip to Najaf al-Ashraf when we met some of the top ulama and the scholars in the Hawza. These were the people who were right below the line of Sayyid Sistani. And the question they asked us, this was a gathering, it was a think tank gathering. The question that they asked was this. The person who asked the question, him and his family, they spent several years in prison, in Abu Ghuraib and other prisons in the era of Saddam, and were tortured extensively. And you know, in that environment, do you know how Tashayyu was transferred from one to the other? They had one copy of the Quran, and Ayatollah Sayyid Sa'id al-Hakim, who's still alive in Najaf, he would teach them from memory whatever he remembered based on the Quran. And when they went back and checked, the family and those students who were there, they created a hawza in the actual prison. They found those references exactly spot on or 1 or 2 pages off. That's it. The question he asked after spending years in prison unjustly and being tortured was, what is your struggle for Islam? What is your contribution to Islam? And we didn't have an answer. I thought about it for a moment and I said, with all due respect, Sayyid, you've gone through a tremendous struggle, and this is not to undermine it at all. But perhaps your struggle was physical in nature, where you had to go through torture of the body and being imprisoned. Perhaps our challenge is different living in developed modern societies. Maybe our challenge is psychological. Where I see, for example, on the news and in the media, my religion is being vilified. And people are saying Islam is this and Islam is that. And I'm seeing what's going on in France, and I'm seeing that people are trying to ban the hijab, and people are saying that Muslims are backwards and this, that, and the other. And in that environment, do I still choose to believe or not? That may be my test. And that may be what God judges me on and assesses me on. Because the riwayat in terms of Imam Sahib al-Zaman are very clear. As time gets closer to the Imam Zuhur, there will be very few believers. Very few. And remember, there are darajat in Iman. One level being just people who say Bismillah, who say they are Muslims. They do taslim. And the Quran says, they say they are mu'min. The Quran says, Allah says, don't say that you are mu'min. You have brought iman, you have not brought iman. You just said Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, or you just said La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. You have become Muslim, but you're not mu'min yet. You are not muttaqi yet. You are not of the sabirin yet. You are not of the shakirin yet. There are darajat to this. So the question that you and I need to ask is, why am I here? And try to get an answer to that question outside of the material. Because believe me, I'm dealing with this every single day. Do you know how many youth come to me and tell me they feel empty, they feel purposeless? And when you feel empty and purposeless, you have to understand what psychologists and philosophers have said. Man's search for meaning. Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl wrote one of the most successful books in the 20th century after he spent time in concentration camps in Europe. And what he saw his wife die, his parents die, his whole family died. But he was a psychologist and a psychiatrist who was in these concentration camps and was studying society. And he said that if they do everything to me, there's one thing that they cannot touch. And those are my thoughts, my ideas. I control those. He said man is constantly searching for meaning. And when man does not get meaning in life, man tries to fill the lack of meaning in life with pleasure. So I try to get a nice car, a nice house, a nice meal. I try to fill it with hedonism, pleasure maximizing. And that never solves the problem. Because Dr. Frankl says the underlying reason is emptiness. There are several other researchers. Psycho-cybernetics, many of you may have read the book. It was written by a man who was a plastic surgeon, a doctor who was a plastic surgeon. And he wrote one of the most famous books of the 20th century as well. Final point. He would see his clients come into his office and get plastic surgery on their faces because they didn't like something about their bodies or their face. And they would get it fixed. And he said after they spent thousands of dollars fixing their physical appearance, he realized that his patients, their problem was not solved because the problem was never physical. The problem was in the soul and the psychology. It was in the thing that you could not see. They had low self-esteem because their society said your value belongs to how many people think you're attractive. Your value depends on how much people think you are wealthy, how much money you have. That's why so many people who have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of followers on social media, they complain and they say, I know that if I expose myself physically and I put a picture on social media, I'll get 1 million likes. But if I say something with substance, I'll get hardly 5 or 10. Understand what's going on in our world. I don't want you to suffer from depression, anxiety, worry, and concern the way the majority and the trend of our society is going. That's the essence, and that is what the Quran is inviting us to do. You and I have been created for a much bigger purpose. The Quran says, and the Ahlul Bayt says, Amir al-Mu'mineen, the final line, Amir al-Mu'mineen says, your bare minimum price is heaven, is Jannah. Do not sell yourself for less. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless this holy gathering. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to understand glimpses of the Quran, to allow us to reflect on the Quran, the Word of God, to allow us to understand that this is a living book, a living constitution to allow us to live more helpful lives and more progressive lives in the truest sense of the words and more fulfilling lives. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to learn from the lives of Rasulullah and the Ahlul Bayt and the Prophets. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, anyone who is suffering from any illness, whether COVID or otherwise, grant them shifa in this night. Anyone who is suffering from a financial difficulty, Ya Allah, grant them alleviation from that financial difficulty in this night. Ya Allah, bless all those who have been volunteering, those who have been contributing, those who have been helping in any way to make these programs happen. I see people over and over coming so early, leaving so late, contributing whatever way. May Allah bless them and their families, those who are known to us and those who are not known to us. Ya Allah, bless all of them. Ya Allah, hasten the reappearance of Imam Sahib al-Asr wal-Zaman and allow us to be amongst his companions when he returns. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Ziyarat.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah. Assalamu alayka ya Ibn Rasulillah. Assalamu alayka ya Khiyarat Allah wa Ibn Khiyaratih. Assalamu alayka ya Ibn Amir al-Mu'mineen wa Ibn Sayyid al-Wasi'een. Assalamu alayka ya Ibn Fatima سيدة نساء العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا مولاي وابن مولاي. السلام عليك يا غريب الغرباء. السلام عليك يا سلطان أبا الحسن علي بن موسى الرضا. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا مولانا يا صاحب العصر والزمان. السلام عليك يا خليفة الرحمن. السلام عليك يا شريك القرآن. السلام عليك يا كعبة الإيمان. السلام عليك يا مولانا يا صاحب العصر والزمان. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم قل لوليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليهم وعلى آبائي في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. الفاتحة.